Centuries ago, the wind in the mountains echoed with war drums. The Lotha and Sangtam clans, proud and rooted in their territories, maintained an endless rivalry, fueled by disputes that seemed to have no end. It was not just a fight for land. It was a battle for honor rooted in generations of history, resentment, and pride. Kezang was a young leader of the Lotha clan. Since childhood, he had witnessed the suffering and sacrifice of his people. The land that had once flourished with crops was now marked by trenches and combat zones. The life of the Lotha was centered on protecting what little remained and resisting the attacks of the enemy. Kezang had inherited, along with his responsibilities, the weight of this historical enmity. Kezang clearly remembered the stories his grandfather had told him around the fire, tales of times when the two tribes shared the plains and rivers, a time when collaboration was possible. However, these stories now seemed more legend than reality. To the young warriors, the Sangtam clan represented a constant threat, an ancient enemy, faceless and without empathy. One night, as Kezang gazed at the sky, he found himself lost in thoughts of peace, wondering if his people could ever live without the constant strain of war. But those thoughts were abruptly interrupted. A warrior ran toward him, announcing an ambush by the Sangtam in one of their nearby villages. Kezang led his warriors towards the site of the attack. The battle was brutal and merciless. The shouts from both sides mingled with the clash of weapons. In the midst of the fight, Kezang came face to face with a Sangtam warrior, a young man of his own age who fought with the same fervor. The image was etched in his mind, both of them representing their clans and a generation trapped in a cycle of hatred. The battle left scars on the bodies and souls of both clans. For Kezang, this encounter was a turning point. The war was consuming their lives, driving them further and further away from any possibility of reconciliation. As he watched the sunrise, Kezang felt an inner shift. He understood that true victory lay not in the annihilation of his enemy, but in breaking the cycle of hatred. That day, Kezang decided to find another way to lead his people. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also understood that someone had to dare to challenge old grudges. Peace was a distant ideal, almost impossible, but in his heart, he knew it was the only path to a future where his people could prosper again. So with a deep sigh and the weight of generations on his shoulders, Kezang took his first step toward what would become the most daring attempt of his life. Forging peace between clans who believed themselves destined to hate each other. Kezang had grown up in the Lotha clan with the firm belief that his people must defend their land and their honor at any cost. As a child, he had learned to handle weapons, to study the tactics of war, and to distrust the Sangtam, who were seen as a perpetual threat. Yet something within him could not fully reconcile himself to this legacy of hatred and violence. After each battle, seeing his people wounded or fields devastated, he felt an uneasiness that he could not explain. One day, after a skirmish in which several young Lotha warriors had been wounded, Kezang went to the mountains surrounding his village. There, in a small, isolated hut, lived Yama, a wise old woman who had witnessed times of peace before the war. The villagers deeply respected her, although few dared to visit her. They said that Yama saw beyond the tangible world, and that her words carried the weight of years and ancestors. Kezang arrived home and after a brief bow sat quietly beside her. Yama, his eyes tired but filled with a serene glow, asked him what tormented him. Kezang confessed that he found war an unbearable burden, that he found no honor in seeing his friends and his people continually suffer. Yama's words were profound and direct. He told her of a time when the Lotha and Sangtam clans had coexisted in peace, sharing the resources of the land and helping each other in times of need. The ancestors did not wish for us to live in a cycle of hatred and revenge, Yama said, his voice a whisper on the wind. Peace requires more courage than war, Kezang, but only those with a firm heart and a clear mind can hope to achieve it. Kezang felt those words spark something within him. His warrior tradition and duty to his clan weighed heavily on him, but the idea of changing the course of his history, of freeing himself from the shackles of war, filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. Kezang realized that his path must be different, and that he must somehow find a way to negotiate peace. Yama offered his support and promised that though the road would be difficult, his ancestors would be at his side if he had the strength to carry on. Kazang knew his plan required extreme risk. He must venture into the lands of the Sangtam clan to meet his supposed enemy up close. He knew the dangers involved. If discovered, his life could end there and then. Yet he was willing to take the risk, convinced that only by seeing the humanity in the enemy could he truly commit to peace. Dressed in simple clothes and camouflaged in the forest, Kazang secretly crossed the border into the Sangtam lands. For days, he silently observed the life of the enemy village, and what he found was revealing. The Sangtam were not so different from his own people. The men and women worked in the fields, cared for their children, and shared moments of joy and pain, just like the Lotha. They were not ruthless monsters, but people trapped in the same cycle of hatred that he had begun to question. During one of his raids, Kazang was discovered by a young Sangtam named Zuko, who also happened to be the youngest leader of the enemy clan. At first, Zuko was prepared to confront him, suspecting him of being a spy. However, when Kazang, in an act of bravery, confessed his identity and his purpose of seeking peace, Zuko regarded him with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. Kazang and Zuko spent that first night in a tense discussion. Zuko expressed his doubts and anger. To him, the Lotha were responsible for many of his clan's losses, and he couldn't imagine anyone truly wanting peace. However, as Kazang told him about Yama's ideas and the suffering of both peoples, Zuko began to listen more intently. Despite his resentment, a part of him longed for a future without war, even if it was difficult to conceive. Kazang proposed to Zuko that they meet again on neutral ground to continue the conversation and explore the possibility of an alliance. Though skeptical, Zuko agreed, acknowledging that it might be worth hearing more before dismissing the idea of peace. At the next meeting, Kazang and Zuko met in a clearing in the forest, far from the eyes of their villages. Both young men arrived with a mixture of mistrust and hope, aware that their lives could depend on that conversation. They sat across from each other in silence, trying to read the intentions in their counterparts' eyes. Kazang spoke first, outlining his vision for lasting peace and the sharing of the land's resources. He proposed that instead of dividing their territories, the two clans could establish shared borders and work together to plant and harvest crops, just as their ancestors had done. Zuko listened, but his eyes were filled with skepticism and doubt. For Zuko, war was a way to honor his fallen ancestors and the leaders who had lost their lives in past battles. He also feared the reaction of his clan elders, who would view any kind of truce as a sign of weakness. Despite these fears, his respect for Kazang began to grow. He recognized a different kind of bravery in him, a determination not rooted in hatred, but in a desire to protect his people. The two young men argued until dawn, exchanging ideas and facing their fears. Despite their differences, they began to build mutual respect. They decided to continue their meetings and explore ways to present their ideas for peace without offending their clans. They both understood that it would be a monumental challenge, but for the first time, they felt that peace was possible. Meetings between Kazang and Zuko continued in secret, both of them becoming increasingly convinced that peace was the only way to free their people from the cycle of hatred. However, they knew that their elders would not easily accept their ideas, and that any attempt at reconciliation would be seen as a betrayal of their traditions and those who had fallen in battle. Tensions rose as elders from both clans grew suspicious of their absences. Kazang and Zuko had to move cautiously to avoid arousing the ire of the older leaders, who held deeply held views of war and honor. However, both young men remained steadfast in their commitment to peace. They decided that their best chance to convince their clans would be to make small changes and prepare their warriors for a new mindset. In addition, they began to secretly spread tales of the ancient peace that once existed between the clans, reminding their people that unity and collaboration were part of their true heritage. This effort, though slow, began to generate doubts in the younger ones and opened a small window of hope. The decision was made. Even though they faced obstacles and threats, Kazang and Zuko would continue their mission, confident that one day their clans could share the land without fear or hatred. Tensions between the clans reached a critical point when a misunderstanding at the border sparked an unexpected conflict. The seemingly minor dispute quickly escalated, with senior leaders of both clans declaring war inevitable. Kazang and Zuko, aware of the danger this posed to their plans for peace, realized that time was running out. Desperate to stop the impending battle, the two young leaders embarked on a risky mission. They attempted to calm their warriors and persuade them that violence would not resolve the conflict. However, their words fell on deaf ears. The enmity was so deeply rooted in their hearts that the call for peace seemed like an insult. Many of the warriors, driven by rage and pride, prepared to confront each other with renewed ferocity. The night before the battle, Kazang and Zuko met once more in secret. They knew that stopping this war would be nearly impossible, but they also understood that if they didn't try, their clans would be trapped in a cycle of destruction. It was then that they made the decision to come to the battlefield at dawn, not as enemies, but as ambassadors of peace. As dawn broke, both clans began to march toward the field, ready for confrontation. Warriors, weapons in hand and hardened hearts, advanced to the beat of war drums. Upon reaching the field, Kazang and Zuko moved ahead of their troops, exposing themselves in full view of everyone. The warriors, shocked and confused, stopped. Amid a silence that seemed eternal, the young leaders raised their voices. They spoke of the devastation that war brought, of lost generations and lives sacrificed in vain. Kazang shared the story of his grandfather, a man who had lost his entire family in the war and who, until his last breath, had longed for peace. As his words echoed through the air, some warriors began to lower their weapons, hesitant. Zuko, for his part, spoke of the dreams he had had of a future where his children and Kazang's children need not know each other as enemies. His voice trembled with the emotion of someone who deeply understood the weight of his words. However, the older leaders were not willing to give in. Tradition and ancestral pride remained firmly in their hearts. In a last-ditch attempt, one of the elders ordered the warriors to attack the young leaders, accusing them of treason and cowardice. At that moment, Kazang and Zuko understood that their lives were in danger. But they also knew that to back down would be to betray their convictions. Standing firm and vulnerable, Kazang and Zuko looked into each other's eyes and nodded. They knew their sacrifice might be the last effort to achieve peace, and they were both willing to give it their all. As the warriors advanced toward them, their final words were a call to reason and true courage, to build a future where their clans could prosper together. The sun had barely begun to rise when the battlefield was filled with the tension of a deathly silence. Kazang and Zuko, standing before the warriors of their respective clans, felt the weight of generations of hatred and conflict weighing on their souls. Faced with the possibility of their own deaths, both young leaders had made the irrevocable decision to defend peace, even at the cost of their own lives. Around them, warriors advanced slowly, some with shaking hands, others with their gazes fixed on their supposed enemies. The elders of both clans, furious and determined to assert their authority, ordered the attack. Yet, at that instant, something changed. Several of the younger warriors, those who had heard Kazang and Zuko's words, began to hesitate. Their swords remained raised, but their feet faltered. It was then that a wise old man from the Lotha clan, who had been Kazang's mentor and had seen his efforts to seek peace, stepped forward. "Enough," he said in a firm voice. "We have seen too many generations of bloodshed. What will we gain from another battle today? More orphaned children? More deserted lands?" His voice was that of someone who had lost so much that his soul could no longer find relief in vengeance. The elder of the Sangtam clan, an authority figure whose own family had suffered at the hands of the Lotha, listened to her words in silence. Though anger still burned within him, the words resonated deep within him. In his heart, he knew that the cycle of hatred had consumed not only their lands, but also their lives and dignity. With a deep sigh, Elder Sangtam nodded. "The scars of this war are deep, but if we shed more blood today, there will be no healing." His words echoed those of his counterpart Lotha, and together, the two elders gave the order to stop, a gesture that had seemed unlikely just a few minutes ago. In an act of symbolic reconciliation, Kazang and Zuko, still trembling from the danger they had just faced, walked toward the center of the battlefield, extending their hands toward each other. In a silent gesture, Zuko took Kazang's hand, and the two stood, looking at each other with the solemnity of those who understand the weight of their mission. All around them, warriors, inspired by the example of their leaders, began to drop their weapons, one after another, until the ground was strewn with abandoned swords and spears. The war drums died away, and in their place rose a murmur of awe and disbelief. That morning, the battlefield was not a place of death, but of forgiveness and reconciliation. Both clans, encouraged by the speeches of their young leaders and wise elders, decided to walk together to their villages as a sign of peace. It was a journey full of mixed emotions. Some warriors wept for those who had not lived to see that day, while others looked to the future with renewed hope. With the weight of centuries of conflict finally behind them, the Lotha and Sangtam clans came together to plan a ceremony to symbolize their new pact of peace. This ceremony would not only be a symbolic act, but a solemn commitment by both clans to protect the harmony achieved with so much sacrifice. Kazang and Zuko, the young leaders who risked everything, took on the responsibility of organizing this historic event. The ceremony would take place in a green and fertile valley, a place located between the lands of both clans. It was a neutral, almost sacred site, known to all as the last uncontested territory. There would be a memorial there, built with stones collected by the warriors of both clans, on which would be engraved the names of all those who had fallen in the war, as a reminder of the costs of hostility. On the day of the ceremony, villagers from both clans began arriving at dawn, wearing their finest clothes and bringing offerings as a sign of respect. The elders, who had lived through the worst times of war, looked on with eyes filled with tears and wonder. Peace, that impossible dream, was finally real. The children, who until then had been taught to distrust the other clan, now played together, running around the field as their laughter filled the air. In the center of the valley, Kazang and Zuko stood facing each other, surrounded by the elders and warriors on both sides. The two young leaders spoke with a sincerity that moved everyone. Kazang recalled the sacrifices of his grandfather and those who had fought for a better future. Zuko, for his part, spoke of his people's dreams of living without fear and building a legacy of peace and prosperity. In a solemn moment, both leaders took a torch and lit the fire on the central altar, as a symbol of the light that would guide their people. Afterwards, the elders of both clans took an oath before their people, committing to honor the peace treaty and work together for the prosperity of their lands. The climactic moment came when Kazang and Zuko knelt before the elders, who, in an act of blessing and recognition, anointed them with water and sacred leaves, an ancient ritual that symbolized the purity of their intentions. From that day on, Kazang and Zuko would be known not only as leaders, but as guardians of peace. The ceremony continued into the evening, with dances and songs from both tribes merging into a single rhythm that celebrated life and reconciliation. The villagers shared food and gifts, and in a gesture of solidarity, exchanged personal items as a symbol of friendship and mutual commitment. At the end of the day, as the sun began to set, Kazang and Zuko, exhausted but satisfied, looked out over the transformed valley. The shadows of night loomed over the countryside, but rather than fearing them, they both felt that they represented a new beginning. They knew that their mission did not end there. Peace must be protected and cultivated day by day. Yet in that moment, surrounded by their people and a new spirit of unity, they felt that, for the first time, the dream of peace was truly possible. Years passed, and the wounds of war slowly began to heal. The villages of the Lotha and Sangtam clans prospered in ways few had imagined possible. The fields flourished again, and families from both clans worked together, sharing the fruits of the land and the water of the rivers. Warriors, once accustomed to carrying weapons, now used their hands to build houses, plant crops, and raise temples of peace. Kazang and Zuko, who had led their clans toward reconciliation, continued to work as peacekeepers. They had learned that peace was not a goal, but a constant path. Occasionally, minor conflicts or tensions would arise, But both leaders held regular meetings where they would resolve any disputes before they could escalate. The friendship that had grown between them became a symbol of unity for their people. Over time, the children who had been born after the peace treaty grew up without knowing the fear of war. They learned about the sacrifices of their ancestors, not as a story of hatred, but as a lesson about the power of forgiveness and the importance of unity. The monument in the valley became a sacred site, a place where each year the clans held a peace ceremony, remembering that harmony was a daily choice. Kazang, now in his old age, would sit by the memorial each year, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, telling the story of how one day he and Zuko had risked everything to achieve the seemingly impossible. His words were heard with reverence, and his legacy as a leader had become an example to all. At one such ceremony, Zuko, similarly aged, joined him. The two men, who had once found themselves on opposite sides of an endless war, shared a deep silence, looking at each other with gratitude and respect. Without needing words, they understood that their actions had changed the fate of their peoples forever. As the sun set over the horizon, turning the sky into shades of gold and red, Kazang and Zuko stood by the monument, watching their descendants and their people celebrate in peace. In that moment, they both felt an inner peace that transcended time and space, a feeling of having fulfilled their purpose. The peace they had forged was not only their legacy, but the gift they left for future generations, an eternal reminder that even in the most hate-torn lands, it is always possible to build a new dawn.